In a quiet corner of rural Texas, there was a man who had seen it all. He wasn't your average ranch owner. He was someone people used to call the Bulldog back in his days as the Attorney General. This guy, let's just call him Richard, had spent decades fighting corruption, exposing scandals, and standing up for what was right. But after years of high-stakes battles, he decided enough was enough. He traded courtroom drama for wide-open spaces, buying himself a sprawling ranch where life moved slower, quieter, and far away from chaos. Richard loved his new life. Every morning, he'd sit on his porch with a cup of strong coffee, watching the sunrise over fields dotted with horses grazing lazily. His wife kept busy tending to their vegetable garden, while their grandchildren visited often during weekends. It was simple, peaceful, and exactly how Richard wanted it. But even paradise has its thorns. Living next door to an overly controlling homeowners association, HOA, wasn't easy. The HOA ruled the neighborhood like some sort of mini dictatorship, enforcing strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to lawn height. At first, Richard tried to play nice. When they sent letters complaining about his excessive landscaping, he ignored them because, well, his land technically fell outside their jurisdiction. And when they accused him of building structures without permission, he shrugged it off, knowing full well they couldn't touch him legally. Still, tension simmered beneath the surface. Some neighbors whispered that Richard thought he was above everyone else, while others admired his refusal to bow down to the HOA's demands. To be honest, Richard didn't care much either way. He wasn't out to make enemies or win popularity contests. All he wanted was to live his life in peace. Then one day, something strange happened. Heavy rains flooded parts of the area, including a small creek running through Richard's property. A few days later, rumors started swirling around town. Someone claimed Richard had built a dam on the creek, causing water to overflow onto neighboring properties. Of course, this was nonsense. Richard hadn't touched the creek, he barely went near it. But the HOA latched onto the story like it was gospel truth. They sent more letters, threatening fines and legal action if Richard didn't fix the so-called problem immediately. Richard laughed it off at first. Who did these people think they were? Did they really believe? Waste time damming a tiny creek? But then came the phone calls. Anonymous voices accusing him of being reckless, selfish, and destructive. One caller even said, "You'll regret messing with us." Richard hung up every time, shaking his head. These folks clearly had too much time on their hands. That's why, on a crisp Monday morning, Richard never expected trouble to come knocking quite literally. As he sat sipping his coffee, enjoying the fresh breeze, two unmarked cars rolled up his long gravel driveway. Out stepped four men dressed in uniforms that looked vaguely official. Badges glinted on their belts, and guns hung holstered at their sides. Richard squinted against the sunlight, wondering what on earth was going on. "Hands up!" one of them shouted, pointing a weapon straight at him. "Don't move!" Richard froze, heart pounding. What in the world was happening? For a split second, fear gripped him. Then logic kicked in. Something about these guys felt off. Their uniforms weren't standard-issue police gear, and their badges seemed shiny and new, almost fake. Plus, real cops wouldn't pull up in unmarked cars like this. No sirens, no proper identification, it didn't add up. Even so, Richard knew better than to argue with armed men. Slowly, he raised his hands, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "What's this about?" he asked, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. One of the men stepped forward, glaring at him. "You're under arrest," he barked. "Trespassing, environmental violations, destruction of private property, you're coming with us." Richard blinked. Was this some kind of joke? Arrested? For what? building a dam that didn't exist? The absurdity of the situation hit him hard, but instead of laughing, anger bubbled inside him. Whoever these clowns were, they clearly had no idea who they were dealing with. As they cuffed him and shoved him toward one of the cars, Richard's mind raced. He noticed details, the make and model of the vehicles, the nervous glances exchanged. Between the men, snippets of conversation muttered under their breath. One phrase stood out: "This is exactly what the board wanted." That confirmed it. The HOA was behind this ridiculous stunt. For a moment, Richard considered resisting. He could fight back, demand answers, maybe even take control of the situation. But he held back. There would be time for that later. Right now, he needed to stay calm, gather evidence, and figure out what these imposters planned to do with him. Whatever their game was, Richard vowed silently, they were about to learn a very painful lesson. You don't mess with a former attorney general unless you're ready for the consequences. Richard sat in the back seat of the unmarked car, hands cuffed behind his back, staring out the window as the countryside rolled by. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. On one hand, he was furious. How dare these people think they could get away with this? On the other hand, he couldn't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of it all. These imposters weren't just breaking laws. They were making rookie mistakes that screamed incompetence. Yet here he was, stuck in their clutches, and that realization only fueled his determination to turn the tables. The men driving didn't say much, but Richard caught snippets of their conversation. They talked about the board again, referring to the HOA leaders who had clearly orchestrated this whole mess. One of them mentioned something about teaching him a lesson, while another muttered nervously about whether this plan would actually work. It was obvious they weren't seasoned criminals. They were amateurs hired to do dirty work, probably without fully understanding the consequences of messing with someone like Richard. As they drove deeper into unfamiliar territory, Richard's mind raced. He needed a plan. First, he had to figure out where they were taking him. Second, he had to find a way to escape or alert someone before things spiraled further out of control. And third, he had to gather enough evidence to expose this absurd scheme once he got free. The problem was, none of those steps seemed easy right now. But Richard wasn't the kind of person to give up. Decades of high-pressure situations had taught him how to stay calm when others panicked. So instead of letting fear take over, he focused on observing every detail around him. The car eventually pulled off the main road onto a dirt path surrounded by thick trees. After winding through the forest for what felt like miles, they arrived at an abandoned-looking storage unit complex. The buildings were weathered, with rusted metal doors and weeds growing between cracks in the pavement. It looked like the kind of place no one would ever stumble upon by accident. Perfect for keeping someone hidden or worse. When they dragged Richard out of the car, he took note of everything: the license plates on the vehicles, the faces of his captors, even the way they moved. Every little detail could prove useful. Later, inside one of the units, they pushed him inside and slammed the door shut, leaving him alone in near darkness. The air smelled musty, and the only light came from a small crack near the ceiling. Despite the grim setting, Richard refused to let panic creep in. Instead, he started assessing his situation. He tested the handcuffs first. They weren't the strongest pair he'd ever seen, which gave him hope. Then he remembered the wire tucked into the sole of his boot, a habit left over from his days working undercover investigations. Carefully, he bent down and used his teeth to pull the wire free. It took some effort, but after a few minutes, he managed to wiggle it into position behind his back and start working on the lock. Years of practice paid off, and within 10 minutes, the cuffs clicked open. Free from the restraints, Richard wasted no time. He scanned the storage unit for anything else he could use: an old chair leg, loose screws, anything, but found nothing helpful. That meant his best bet was getting out of there fast. He pressed his ear against the door, listening for movement outside. When he heard footsteps fading into the distance, he knew it was now or never. Using his shoulder, he rammed the door with all his strength. To his relief, the lock gave way, and the door swung open just enough for him to slip through. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty lot. Richard spotted one of the cars still parked nearby, its engine idling. Whoever had left it there clearly thought they had plenty of time before needing to check on him. Without hesitation, Richard sprinted toward the vehicle. As he reached it, he hesitated briefly, wondering if stealing a getaway car might complicate things legally. But then he reminded himself, these weren't real cops and he was acting in self-defense. Besides, he'd deal with the legalities later. Right now, survival came first. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, thankful the car started without any issues. Glancing around one last time to make sure no one was watching, he sped off down the dirt road. Adrenaline coursed through him as he navigated the bumpy path, finally emerging onto a paved highway. Once he was certain he wasn't being followed, he slowed down and began looking for help. A short while later, he flagged down a passing motorist, a middle-aged woman driving a pickup truck. She stopped cautiously, eyeing Richard's disheveled appearance warily. "Need a hand?" she asked, her tone guarded. "My car broke down back there," Richard lied smoothly, gesturing vaguely behind him. "Mind giving me a lift to the nearest town?" She hesitated for a moment but eventually nodded. "Sure, hop in." During the ride, Richard kept quiet, not wanting to raise suspicion. When they reached the outskirts of town, he thanked her profusely and stepped out near a gas station. From there, he called a trusted friend who lived nearby and explained what had happened. By the time he returned home, exhaustion hit him like a freight train. But despite his fatigue, Richard couldn't rest, not yet. Back at his ranch, he immediately reviewed the security footage from earlier that day. Sure enough, the cameras had captured everything. The fake officers arriving, dragging him out of the house, and speeding away in their unmarked cars. Richard jotted down license plate numbers and noted physical descriptions of each man. Then he drafted a detailed account of the entire ordeal, including timestamps and observations. This document would serve as the foundation for exposing the truth, but Richard knew going public wouldn't be enough. People love drama, but they also love doubting stories unless presented with undeniable proof. So he reached out to a journalist friend he'd worked with during his time as attorney general. The two had always shared a mutual respect, and Richard trusted him to handle the story responsibly. Over the phone, he laid out the facts, emphasizing the absurdity of the situation. "They sent fake cops to arrest me," he said bluntly. "And they forgot one tiny detail on the guy who used to put criminals like them behind bars." His friend laughed darkly. "This is insane. Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Richard replied. "I need your help to make sure everyone hears about this." By sunrise, the story exploded across news outlets nationwide. Headlines blared phrases like "Former Attorney General Kidnapped by Fake Cops" and "HOA Gone Rogue, a Tale of Power and Corruption." Public outrage grew almost instantly. Neighbors who had previously avoided getting involved suddenly spoke up, sharing similar experiences of harassment by the HOA. Social media lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForRichard and #StopHOABullying. Even federal authorities took notice, launching an investigation into the incident. Yet amid the chaos, Richard received a chilling phone call late one night. The voice on the other end was low and menacing. "You should have stayed quiet," the caller growled. "Drop this matter, or you'll regret it." For the first time since the ordeal began, Richard felt a flicker of fear. Up until now, he'd assumed the HOA's action stemmed from arrogance and ignorance. But this threat suggested something darker, a level of desperation he hadn't anticipated. Whoever was pulling the strings clearly had more at stake than just teaching him a lesson. And that realization made the stakes infinitely higher. Despite the warning, Richard refused to back down. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. These people thought they could intimidate him into silence, but they underestimated who they were dealing with. He'd spent years dismantling powerful organizations and exposing corruption. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one, and Richard wasn't about to lose. Richard hung up the phone after that chilling call, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He wasn't afraid, not really, but he couldn't deny the weight of what was happening. Someone out there wanted him silenced, and they weren't playing games anymore. This wasn't just about teaching him a lesson or settling some petty HOA dispute. There was something bigger at play here, something dangerous. And Richard knew if he didn't dig deeper, he might not live long enough to see justice served. The next morning, Richard sat at his kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. The security footage from his ranch, the notes he jotted down during his escape, and the journalist's article were all laid out like pieces of a puzzle. But puzzles need context, and Richard needed answers. Who exactly was behind this? Why go to such lengths to target him? And most importantly, what did they stand to gain? He decided it was time to bring in reinforcements. Richard reached out to a private investigator he'd worked with in the past, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who specialized in uncovering secrets others tried to bury. Over the phone, Richard explained everything: the fake arrest, the storage unit, the threatening call. "I need you to dig into the HOA," he said firmly. "Find out who's pulling the strings and why." The investigator agreed without hesitation. "This sounds like more than just a neighborhood squabble," he replied. "Give me a few days." While waiting for the investigator's findings, Richard kept busy. He spent hours combing through public records, researching the HOA's leadership and their connections. What he discovered shocked even him. The HOA wasn't just a group of overzealous homeowners trying to enforce ridiculous rules. It was a front for something far more sinister. Behind the scenes, powerful developers and investors were using the organization to manipulate property values and seize control of valuable land. His ranch, with its sprawling acres and prime location, was apparently a key piece of their plan. As the days passed, the investigators started piecing together the bigger picture. It turned out the HOA board members weren't ordinary people. Many had ties to shady real estate deals and questionable business practices. One name kept popping up again and again, a man who acted as the HOA's president but also happened to be a major player in local development projects. This guy wasn't just interested in enforcing mailbox colors or lawn heights, wanted to reshape the entire area for profit. But the real bombshell came when the investigator uncovered evidence of bribery and coercion. Board members had allegedly pressured neighbors into selling their properties below market value, sometimes using intimidation tactics. Those who refused often faced harassment, lawsuits, or worse. Richard realized now why they had targeted him so aggressively. They thought he'd fold under pressure, sell his land, and disappear quietly. Instead, they had picked the wrong fight, and they were about to regret it. Armed with this new information, Richard filed multiple lawsuits against the HOA and its leaders. He accused them of racketeering, conspiracy, and impersonating law enforcement officers. Each filing sent shockwaves through the community, especially when news outlets picked up on the story. Reporters swarmed the area, interviewing neighbors and digging into the HOA's activities. For the first time, People started speaking out openly about their own experiences with the organization. Neighbors began sharing stories that painted a disturbing picture. Some talked about receiving anonymous threats after refusing to sell their homes. Others described being fined exorbitant amounts for minor infractions, like painting their front door the wrong shade of blue. A few admitted they'd sold their properties out of fear, only to later discover their land was resold at a massive profit to developers. These accounts added fuel to the fire, turning public opinion squarely against the HOA. Meanwhile, cracks started forming within the HOA itself. Several board members resigned in protest, claiming they hadn't known the full extent of what was going on. Others turned whistleblower, providing testimony that corroborated Richard's claims. One former member revealed how the HOA had hired mercenaries posing as police officers specifically to intimidate Richard. Another confessed to falsifying documents accusing him of environmental violations. Their testimonies became critical pieces of evidence in Richard's case. Despite mounting pressure, the remaining HOA leaders doubled down, issuing increasingly desperate statements denying all wrongdoing. They accused Richard of fabricating lies to smear their reputation and insisted they were simply doing their job. But their denials rang hollow, especially when federal authorities stepped in. Agents raided the HOA's offices, seizing computers, files, and financial records. It quickly became clear that the organization's operations were built on a foundation of fraud and corruption. Through it all, Richard remained laser-focused. Every court appearance, every press conference, every late-night strategy session brought him closer to victory. He dismantled their arguments piece by piece, exposing their lies with meticulous precision. In one particularly memorable moment, Richard stood before a packed courtroom holding up a blown-up photo of the fake cops who had arrested him. "These men aren't law enforcement officers," he declared, his voice steady and commanding. "They're hired thugs working for an organization that thinks it's above the law. Well, I'm here to tell you, they're not." Public support for Richard surged. Protesters gathered outside HOA meetings, holding signs that read "Justice for our community and stop bullying homeowners." Local businesses displayed banners in solidarity, while online petitions calling for reform gained thousands of signatures. Even politicians weighed in, promising to introduce legislation to increase oversight of HOAs statewide. What had started as a personal battle had grown into a movement for change. Yet despite the progress, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. The threatening phone call still lingered in his mind, a reminder that someone out there was willing to do whatever it took to protect their interests. He tightened security around his ranch, installing cameras and hiring guards to patrol the property. He also made sure his family stayed safe, urging them to be vigilant and report anything suspicious. One evening, as Richard sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on everything that had happened. The ordeal had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it had also reminded him of something important. Standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Whether it was fighting corruption in Washington, D.C., or taking on a rogue HOA in rural Texas, Richard had always believed in justice. And though the road ahead might still be rocky, he knew he was on the right path. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Richard allowed himself a small smile. Peace had returned for now, but this time he intended to keep it that way. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Richard walked in, flanked by his legal team. Reporters crammed into every available seat, their cameras clicking away like a swarm of restless insects. Neighbors packed the gallery too, some whispering nervously, others sitting stone-faced but clearly invested in what was about to unfold. This wasn't just any trial, it was the culmination of months of scandal, accusations and revelations that had rocked the small community to its core. And Richard? He looked calm, almost eerily so, as if he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. As the judge called the court to order, the opposing side, the HOA's lawyers, tried their best to put up a united front. But it was obvious they were scrambling. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Forged documents, bribes, falsified complaints, and even the hiring of fake cops. Every day brought new bombshells, each one more damaging than the last. Yet despite the mounting pressure, the HOA leadership clung to denial, insisting they were innocent victims of a smear campaign. Their arrogance only made things worse. Richard's opening statement cut through the room like a knife. Standing at the podium, he didn't mince words. "This case isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "It's about accountability. It's about what happens when people think they're untouchable, when they believe they can bend the rules or break them entirely and face no consequences." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. What these individuals did wasn't just illegal. It was an abuse of power. They targeted homeowners, intimidated families, and tried to steal land, all while hiding behind the facade of a neighborhood association. He then turned to the jury, making eye contact with each member. "I'm standing here today not because I want revenge, but because silence isn't an option. If we let this kind of behavior go unchecked, it sets a dangerous precedent. It tells others that they can get away with anything, as long as they have money, influence, or both. That's not the kind of world I want to live in, and I know you don't either." By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the reporters stopped typing, captivated by the raw honesty in his words. Richard sat down, feeling a mix of satisfaction and resolve. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit anymore, it was about sending a message. Over the next few weeks, the trial unfolded like a drama straight out of a movie. Witness after witness took the stand, many of them former HOA members who had decided to come clean. One man described how he'd been pressured into signing over his property at a fraction of its value, only to see it flipped for millions shortly afterward. A woman recounted receiving anonymous threats late at night, warning her to sell her home or face unfortunate consequences. Another neighbor testified about being fined repeatedly for trivial infractions, all while watching developers swoop in to buy neighboring lots at suspiciously low prices. Each story painted a clearer picture of the HOA's true intentions. This wasn't about maintaining property values or ensuring community standards. It was about greed, plain and simple. Developers wanted prime real estate, and the HOA was their tool for getting it. They preyed on vulnerable homeowners, exploiting fear and uncertainty to achieve their goals. And when someone like Richard stood in their way, they resorted to extreme measures. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from one of the fake cops themselves. Arrested during the FBI raid, the man agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. On the stand, he admitted everything: how he and his accomplices had been hired by the HOA, how they'd been told to make the arrest look official, and how they'd assumed Richard would back down once they flexed their supposed authority. When asked why they thought kidnapping a former attorney general was a good idea, the man shrugged sheepishly. "We were just following orders," he muttered. "Nobody said he'd fight back." The crowd erupted in murmurs, and even the judge had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. Richard listened intently, jotting down notes as the man spoke. Every confession, every admission of wrongdoing brought him closer to victory. Still, he knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Trials could be unpredictable, and the HOA's lawyers weren't giving up without a fight. Their defense strategy relied heavily on casting doubt. They argued that Richard had exaggerated the situation, claiming he was using his status to stir up trouble. They accused him of fabricating evidence and manipulating public opinion. At one point, their lead attorney even suggested Richard had orchestrated the whole thing himself as part of some elaborate publicity stunt. Why else would a man with nothing to gain go through all this trouble? The lawyer asked dramatically, gesturing toward Richard. The gallery gasped, but Richard remained unfazed. When it was his turn to respond, he leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but piercing. "If I wanted attention," he said dryly, "I wouldn't have chosen this. Trust me, there are easier ways to get headlines." The courtroom erupted in laughter, and even the judge cracked a smile. Richard's wit disarmed the accusation. Leaving the opposing counsel red-faced and scrambling to recover Dodd as the trial dragged on, cracks continued to form within the HOA ranks. 2 board members abruptly resigned mid-testimony, citing personal reasons. Another collapsed under cross-examination, breaking down in tears as she admitted to forging documents and lying to investigators. By the final week, it was clear the organization was imploding. Their once unified front had crumbled into chaos, and the public watched with morbid fascination as the truth came tumbling out. Outside the courtroom, the story dominated headlines nationwide. Talk shows debated the ethics of HOAs, while social media lit up with hashtags like #HOA accountability and #Stand with homeowners. People shared their own horror stories of dealing with overzealous associations, turning the case into a symbol of resistance against systemic abuse. Politicians jumped on the bandwagon too, introducing bills aimed at increasing transparency and oversight for HOAs across the country. For Richard, the support was overwhelming but also affirming. He hadn't set out to become a crusader, but now that he was one, he embraced the role fully. Every interview request, every invitation to speak, every opportunity to shine a light on the issue became another chance to drive change. He worked tirelessly alongside advocacy groups, helping draft legislation and educating homeowners about their rights. Slowly but surely, momentum shifted in favor of reform. Yet even as the tide turned, Richard couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The threatening phone call still haunted him, a reminder that not everyone involved had been caught. Whoever had orchestrated this scheme likely had connections far beyond the HOA, and Richard knew powerful people didn't take kindly to losing. He stayed vigilant, keeping a close eye on his surroundings and making sure his family remained safe. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with overflow crowds gathered outside. As the jury foreman stood to deliver the decision, the tension in the air was palpable. Richard sat perfectly still, his hands clasped tightly together as the words rang out, "Guilty on all counts." The room erupted in cheers, applause, and even a few tears. Neighbors hugged each other, celebrating a hard-fought victory. Richard exhaled deeply, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had been served not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of the HOA. Afterward, reporters swarmed him, eager for quotes and sound bites. Richard obliged briefly, thanking everyone who had supported him throughout the ordeal. Then he slipped away, retreating to the quiet sanctuary of his ranch. As he stood on his porch, looking out over the fields bathed in golden sunlight, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The battle had been brutal, exhausting, and sometimes terrifying, but it had also reminded him of something important. Good could still triumph over evil, especially when people refused to stay silent. Richard smiled faintly, knowing the fight wasn't entirely over. There would always be bullies, always be those who sought to exploit others for personal gain. But for now, peace had returned, and he intended to savor every second of it. The verdict was in, and the HOA's reign of intimidation had officially come to an end. guilty on all counts. It wasn't just a win for Richard. It was a victory for every neighbor who had ever been bullied, fined unfairly, or forced into selling their property under duress. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Richard didn't stay long to soak it all in. He'd never been one for the spotlight, and after months of relentless stress, he craved nothing more than the quiet solitude of his ranch. When he finally returned home that evening, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the fields. For the first time in what felt like forever, Richard allowed himself to relax. He poured a glass of whiskey, stepped onto the porch, and sank into his favorite chair. As he sipped the drink slowly, he thought about everything that had happened: the fake arrest, the escape from the storage unit, the countless hours spent poring over documents and strategizing with lawyers. It had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but looking back, he realized something important. The fight had changed him. Not in a bad way necessarily, but it reminded him of why he'd become an attorney in the first place, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. The days following the trial were surreal. Reporters continued to call, asking for interviews and follow-up stories. Neighbors stopped by unannounced, offering thanks and sharing tales of their own struggles with the HOA. Some brought homemade pies. Others simply shook his hand and said, "We owe you." Richard appreciated the gestures, but he made it clear he hadn't done this for recognition. "I did it because it was the right thing to do," he told anyone who asked. "If I can help someone else avoid going through what I went through, then it was worth it." Still, the case had sparked something bigger than Richard had anticipated. People across the country started reaching out, homeowners dealing with similar issues, advocacy groups fighting for reform, even lawmakers drafting new legislation. Many wanted advice, while others just needed encouragement. At first, Richard hesitated. He wasn't sure how much energy he had left to give. But as the messages kept coming, he realized he couldn't turn away. These were real people facing real problems, and if his experience could help them, how could he say no? So Richard decided to take action. With the support of his family and friends, he founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating homeowners about their rights and holding HOAs accountable. The group provided resources, legal assistance, and a platform for people to share their stories. They also worked closely with lawmakers to push for stronger regulations and oversight, ensuring no community would have to endure what his had done. It wasn't easy. Running a nonprofit required time, effort, and money resources Richard didn't always feel like he had. There were late nights spent reviewing cases, phone calls with frustrated homeowners, and endless meetings with attorneys and activists. Sometimes, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. But whenever doubt crept in, Richard reminded himself of the faces behind the letters and emails, families who had lost their homes, seniors pressured into selling properties they'd lived in for decades, young couples afraid to speak up because they didn't know where to turn. Their voices kept him going. One day, during a town hall meeting organized by the nonprofit, Richard met a woman whose story hit particularly close to home. She explained how her elderly mother had been harassed by an HOA until she was forced to sell her house at a fraction of its value. By the time the family realized what was happening, it was too late. The developer who bought the property turned around and sold it for triple the price. Listening to her recount the ordeal, Richard saw echoes of his own battle. Her pain was raw, her frustration palpable. When she finished speaking, the room fell silent. Richard stood up and walked over to her. "Thank you for sharing your story," he said gently, "and I'm sorry you had to go through that. But let me tell you something. You're not alone anymore. We're here to help, and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about lawsuits or laws, it was about protecting people, about giving them hope when they felt powerless. And if he could do that, even in a small way, then all the hard work was worth it. As the months passed, progress began to show. Several states introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency and accountability for HOAs. Lawmakers cited Richard's case as a prime example of why reform was necessary. Local governments started requiring stricter oversight, including mandatory audits and third-party reviews of HOA finances. Developers who had once operated in the shadows found themselves under scrutiny, and some even faced criminal charges for their involvement in illegal schemes. Back on the ranch, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such a whirlwind. Richard still kept a close eye on security, wary of lingering threats. But overall, the tension that had hung over the property for so long began to lift. His grandchildren visited more often, running wild through the fields without a care in the world. His wife joked that he should write a book about his experiences, though Richard laughed it off. Who would want to read about an old man getting arrested by fake cops? He teased. But deep down, Richard knew his story mattered, not because it was unique, but because it represented something universal. Everyone faces challenges, big or small. What defines us isn't the obstacles we encounter, but how we choose to respond. For Richard, standing up to the HOA wasn't just about reclaiming his land or clearing his name. It was about proving that integrity and determination could overcome even the toughest odds. On a crisp autumn morning, Richard took a long walk around the ranch, breathing in the fresh air and listening to the sounds of nature. Birds chirped overhead, leaves rustled in the breeze, and horses grazed lazily in the distance. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of recent months. As he stood at the edge of the creek, watching the water flow gently downstream, he reflected on how far he'd come. He thought about the neighbors who had rallied around him, the whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose the truth, and the countless strangers who had reached out seeking help. Each person had played a role in bringing justice to light, and together, they had created something powerful. Change. Richard smiled softly, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Peace had returned to his corner of the world, and this time he intended to keep it that way.